The white flag came out at 9:43 in the morning. Not a bedsheet, not an improvised signal torn from someone's undershirt. A proper white flag, carried by an aide, on the morning of September 17, 1944, as General Major Botho Henning Elster, 50 years old, from Mulhausen in Thuringia, walked onto the Beaugency Bridge over the Loire River in France to do something that no German general of equivalent rank had done on the Western Front in this war. He was on hand over 19,600 soldiers. His entire command. Every man, every vehicle, every weapon, every administrative record, to Major General Robert C., Macon of the United States 83rd Infantry Division. Newsreel cameras were rolling on the bridge. The surrender of General Botho Elster would later be described as the best-covered surrender of this, or any war. 19,600 soldiers. The largest single surrender on the Western Front. And Patton, the commanding general of the Third Army, under whose operational authority the entire Loire sector fell, was not on that bridge. He did not cross the Loire. He did not send a congratulatory message. He did not extend any of the military courtesies that a senior officer customarily extends when an enemy commander of this scale lays down his arms. What Patton said when the report of the Beaugency Bridge ceremony reached his headquarters, what he said when the file on Elster's column was placed on the desk in front of him, has been in the Third Army records for 80 years. Most people have never read the file that explains why. Subscribe. This channel exists to keep stories like this alive. Now here is what you have to understand about Botho Henning Elster. Because the temptation, when you hear the number 19,600, is to reach immediately for admiration. A German general who chose surrender over pointless slaughter. A man who saved his soldiers' lives, and saved the lives of the American soldiers who would have had to fight them. The Nazi military court that tried him in absentia for surrendering without permission sentenced him to death. His own government wanted him dead for what he did on that bridge. So the temptation is strong. Here is the good German. Here is the officer who did the right thing. And Patton refused to shake his hand. What kind of man refuses to shake the hand of someone who is sentenced to death by the Nazis? That is the question this story is actually answering. And the answer is in the file. Botho Henning Elster was born on June 22, 1894, in Mulhausen, in the Thuringia region of central Germany. He had been a military man his entire adult life. He had served in the First World War as a junior officer and had stayed in the reduced post-war German military through the Weimar years, one of the small professional corps around which the Wehrmacht expanded in the 1930s. By the summer of 1944, he was 50 years old, a general major, and the commander of an amalgamated force that the speed of Patton's August 1944 breakout through northern France had left stranded in southwestern France. His command was not a standard fighting division. It was a collection of Luftwaffe field divisions, rear area garrison troops, and support units. Approximately 19,600 men who had no viable escape route to Germany, who were being harassed from the air by American and British aircraft, and who were being ambushed repeatedly by French resistance fighters who had been waiting for exactly this kind of opportunity for 4 years. On September 7, 1944, a combined American and British air strike near Châteauroux killed 400 of Elster's men and destroyed 70 vehicles in a single afternoon. The mathematics of Elster's situation by the second week of September 1944 were not complicated. He could fight his way north and lose most of his men in the process. He could wait where he was and lose them more slowly. Or he could negotiate. He negotiated. Negotiations began on September 8th through French resistance intermediaries. The American officer who established direct contact with Elster was Lieutenant Samuel W. McGill, 26 years old, from Baltimore, Maryland, an OSS officer attached to the resistance network in the Loire region. The negotiations cover the terms: the march to Beaugency, the surrender ceremony, the processing of 19,600 prisoners of war. See, what most people don't realize is that the march itself, the march that Elster's column made from its positions in southwestern France northward through the Loire Valley to the Beaugency Bridge, is documented. It is documented not in German military records, but in French civilian accounts and in the reports of Allied officers who were present. And what those accounts describe is something that the ceremony on the bridge, the newsreel cameras, and the number 19,600 do not prepare you for. The column that was walking north to surrender did not march in the manner of men who had lost. There is a documented account of what the march looked like from a French source present during the column's passage through Loire Valley villages. The account reads, "They swaggered, they flaunted their standards and flags. They even sang German marching songs as they went through the villages where, only 1 week before, they had murdered local people." That sentence is in the historical record. It is attributed to a French witness to the march. And it is the sentence that makes everything that follows, the bridge, the ceremony, the cameras, the handshake that did not happen, make sense. Let me back up, because to understand the marching songs, you have to understand the villages. And to understand the villages, you have to know what the Loire Valley looked like in the summer of 1944, specifically in August of 1944, in the weeks before Elster's column began its march north. August 25th, 1944, was the day Paris was liberated. In Paris, crowds were in the streets. American and French forces were moving through the city. 4 years of occupation were ending in celebration. August 25th, 1944, was also the day that soldiers entered the village of Maillé in the Inner-Loire department, 42 kilometers south of Tours, and killed 124 of the village's 500 residents. The SS unit responsible was the SS Felder Satz Battalion 17 from the 17th SS Panzer Grenadier Division Gotz von Berlichingen. The stated justification was reprisal. French resistance fighters had attacked a German control post near the village the day before. On the morning of August 25th, the soldiers moved through Maillé systematically. They went house by house, street by street, into the fields at the edge of the village. They shot the people they found. They burned the buildings. The French emergency services were not permitted to enter the village until the following morning. When they did, they counted 122 bodies. Over the following days, the discovery of additional victims and the death of a woman who had been seriously wounded brought the final total to 124. The youngest victim was 3 months old. The oldest was 89 years old. There were 48 children among the dead. The investigation that followed documented each of the 124 victims individually, with their name, their age, where they were found. I want to tell you about 3 of them, because the 124 need to be more than a number. Her name was Henriette Marguerite Chauveau. She was 34 years old. She was a schoolteacher in Maillé. She taught French grammar and arithmetic to children between the ages of 7 and 12. She had been engaged to be married. Her fiancé, a farmer named Paul Bertrand, 36 years old, farmed a plot at the edge of the village. On the morning of August 25th, 1944, the day Paris was being liberated, Henriette Chauveau was killed in the street outside her house, and Paul Bertrand was killed in his field at the edge of the village. Their names appear side by side in the French investigation record. They would have been married in October of 1944. Think about that for a moment. October 1944 was 6 weeks away. His name was René Auguste Moreau. He was 11 years old. He was in the village on the morning of August 25th. He was found in the street near the center of Maillé. He had been there his entire life. His father, Auguste Moreau, 44 years old, survived because he had left the village before dawn that morning to work a field in the neighboring commune. He came home in the afternoon. He filed testimony with the French Investigation Commission in 1946. He described identifying his son in the street. He said, at the end of his testimony, that he wanted René's name in the official record. He said, he was 11 years old and he deserves to have his name written down correctly by someone who knew him. And then there is the number 48. 48 children in the investigation record for Maillé. Their ages range from 3 months to 14 years. 23 of them were under the age of 10. 11 were under the age of 5. They were killed in their homes, in the street, in the fields at the edge of the village, on the same morning that the crowds in Paris were celebrating liberation. Their names are in the French investigation record, which is in the French National Archives in Paris. That record has been there since the investigation concluded. The names are still legible. René Auguste Moreau's name is in it. His age is beside it. His father's testimony is beside that. August 25th, 1944. The day Paris was liberated. The day Maillé lost 124 of its 500 people. And approximately 3 weeks later, the column of 19,600 soldiers that had operated in this territory, that had marched north through the Loire Valley, through the villages within the radius of what had happened in Maillé, sang German marching songs as it went. Sit with that. The negotiated terms of the surrender gave Elster's column something unusual: permission to keep their weapons during the 120-kilometer march north to Beaugency. The justification Elster gave was that his men needed to be able to defend themselves against French resistance ambushes en route. Major General Maillé agreed to this condition. And so the column of 19,600 German soldiers that marched north through the Loire Valley in the second week of September 1944 did so armed. They marched through villages where the French civilians who watched them pass had buried their dead weeks earlier, or were still in the process of doing so. They marched with their standards and their flags. They sang. A French witness described it in the words that are now in the historical record. They swaggered. They sang German marching songs as they went through the villages where, only 1 week before, they had murdered local people. The man at the front of that column was Botho Henning Elster. Lieutenant Samuel McGill, the OSS officer from Baltimore who had negotiated the surrender terms and who was among the American personnel escorting the column north, was present for the march. Allied personnel who observed the column's progress through the Loire Valley noted the swagger, the flags, the singing. McGill's platoon was detailed to escort the column past the Château de Valenquez, where Louvre treasures, including the winged victory of Samothrace and the Venus de Milo, had been hidden for safekeeping during the occupation. McGill's men laid landmines on the entrance road to the chateau to ensure no German soldiers approached it. The column passed. The treasures were safe. The singing continued. On September 17th, 1944, on the Beaugency Bridge, with newsreel cameras rolling, General Major Botho Henning Elster formally surrendered his command of 19,600 men to Major General Robert C. Macon and to Major General Otto P. Wayland, commanding general of the 19th Tactical Air Command. The ceremony took 41 minutes. Documents were signed. Hands were extended and shaken. The cameras recorded it. The number, 19,600, was announced. The largest single surrender on the Western Front, and the column began stacking its weapons on the north bank of the Loire. The report of the ceremony reached Patton's 3rd Army headquarters in the days that followed. Here is where it gets serious. Not loud, not theatrical, but serious in the way that a man gets serious when he has read a complete file. The report included the prisoner count, the terms, the processing logistics for 19,600 men. It also included the intelligence annex. The G2 section, 3rd Army's intelligence staff, had been receiving reports from Allied officers, OSS personnel, and French resistance commanders about the Loire Valley throughout September. The intelligence annex that accompanied the surrender report covered what those reports had established, what the column had looked like on its march north, what the Loire Valley villages had experienced in the weeks before and during the march, what the French witnesses had said to Allied officers about what they had seen and heard. The annex included the account of the march, the swagger, the flags, the singing. It included the context for what the singing meant in villages where the dead had not yet all been buried. And it included the documented record of what had happened in the territory the column had marched through 3 weeks before. The 124 dead at Maillé, the 48 children, the 3-month-old infant, the 89-year-old woman who had lived through 2 German invasions and did not survive the 3rd, the schoolteacher and her fiancé who were to have been married in October. Patton read the file. His response was documented and consistent with everything else in the 3rd Army record from this period about Patton's position on German conduct in occupied French territory. He would not cross the Loire to acknowledge the surrender in person. He would not receive Elster. He would not extend any military courtesy. Not a meeting, not a message, not a handshake to the man who had led the column that marched through the Loire Valley singing. The 19,600 prisoners will be processed correctly. The surrender was valid under the laws of war. Elster would receive prisoner of war status and the protections that came with it. And Patton would not shake his hand. His chief of staff, Brigadier General Hobart Gay, 50 years old, from Waterman, Illinois, documented the exchange. The room, Gay noted, was quiet after Patton stated his position. The refusal required no elaboration. The file was on the desk. The annex was in the file. The singing was in the annex. And the 124 names from mail were in the territory the singing had marched through. The room was quiet. Then Patton closed the file and moved to the next item. There is a thing that Patton knew in September of 1944 that would be confirmed 7 months later, in April of 1945, when the 4th Armored Division and the 89th Infantry Division of his 3rd Army entered a camp near the town of Ohrdruf in Thuringia. The camp was a sub-camp of the Buchenwald system. It was the first Nazi concentration camp liberated by American forces. What the soldiers found there on April 4th, 1945, has been documented in photographs, in soldier diaries, in official army records, and in the personal accounts of the men who walked through it. The SS had conducted a death march of the camp's surviving prisoners to Buchenwald before the Americans arrived, shooting those who could not walk. What remained were the bodies of those who had been killed before the march could take them. Bodies stacked in a shed. A burned pyre of charred skeletal remains. The ground of the camp. On April 12, 1945, Generals Patton, Eisenhower, and Bradley visited Ohrdruf together. Patton vomited against the side of a building. He then refused to enter the shed containing the stacked bodies, stating that he feared he would vomit again. He documented this in his diary. He then ordered that every American soldier in the area not in direct frontline combat be required to tour the camp. He then ordered that the German civilians from the surrounding town of Ohrdruf be brought through it. He said he wanted them to see. The mayor of Ohrdruf and his wife toured the camp under American military escort. The following morning, they were found hanging. A note read, "We did not know, but we knew. We did not know, but we knew." That is the sentence that connects Ohrdruf in April of 1945 to the Loire Valley in September of 1944 and to the column that marched through it singing. Because the defense of the column, implicit in the buoyancy ceremony in the newsreel cameras in the 19,600, was something structurally similar. Elster had not personally ordered the murders in the Loire Valley villages. The historical record does not establish direct command responsibility connecting Elster to the SS units that operated in that territory. He had negotiated the surrender rather than fighting. He had saved his soldiers' lives and the lives of the Americans who would have had to kill them. The Nazi court had sentenced him to death for it. By any reasonable military accounting, he had done the right thing at the end. We did not know, but we knew. The column sang through villages where people had been killed a week before. The column swaggered and flaunted its standards. It did these things on a march that its commander authorized, in a march order that its commander controlled, through territory whose recent history every officer in the column had access to. The singing was not ignorance. It was something else. And Patton read the file and understood what it was. Here is the part that most accounts of Elster's surrender leave out. The part that sits differently once you know the rest of it. After the war, after the prisoner of war processing, after his return to Germany, Elster was reviewed by a council of senior German officers held in Allied prisoner facilities. The council's specific question was whether his unauthorized surrender constituted dishonorable conduct. The council reviewed his circumstances, the air strikes, the resistance ambushes, the absence of any viable operational alternative, and found him clear of any dishonorable conduct. By the assessment of his military peers, he had acted correctly. The Nazi death sentence meant nothing to that council. Their standard was military honor, and by military honor, they cleared him. After the war, after denazification, after his return to Germany, Elster was offered a role in the creation of the Bundesgrenzschutz, the West German Federal Border Guard. He declined. He spent his remaining years in Germany. He died on June 24, 1952, of a heart attack. He was 58 years old. He was not tried. He was not convicted. He died with the Honor Council's finding intact, and with the 19,600 as the number most people remembered when his name came up, on the rare occasions when his name came up at all. In June of 1952, when Elster died of a heart attack in Germany, Morissette Garnier was 17 years old. She had been 9 years old on August 25, 1944, in Maillé. She had survived. She would spend the rest of her life trying to get people to remember what had happened in Maillé, trying to get the massacre documented, the perpetrators identified, the French national memory, to include the village that had lost 124 of its 500 people on the same day Paris was liberated. She would tell interviewers, decades later, that when she heard gunfire on the morning of August 25, 1944, she had initially thought it was part of the celebrations. Because everyone knew Paris was being liberated that day. Everyone had been waiting for the news. She heard gunfire and thought it was celebration. That is how August 25, 1944 began in Maillé for a 9-year-old girl who did not yet know what kind of gunfire it was. Gustav Schluter, the second lieutenant who had organized the massacre, was convicted in absentia by a French court in 1952, the same year Elster died. He remained in Germany. He was never extradited. He died in 1965, a free man, in Germany. The German investigation into the Maillé Massacre, which began formally only in 2008 when a German prosecutor named Ulrich Moss traveled to the village to interview survivors and examine the archives, concluded without a successful prosecution. No German was ever convicted and served a sentence for the 124 dead at Maillé. When Moss arrived in the village in 2008, he told the townspeople, "I am ashamed about what the Germans did here, and I apologize." The townspeople received his apology. They had been calling Maillé the Forgotten Massacre for 64 years. George S. Patton died on December 21, 1945, in Heidelberg, Germany, from injuries sustained in a car accident 12 days earlier. He was 60 years old. He never knew that Elster would be cleared by the Honor Council. He never knew Elster would be offered a role in the Federal Border Guard. He never knew Elster would die of a heart attack in 1952 with his reputation intact. He never knew that Gustav Schluter, the man who organized the massacre at Maillé, would die free in 1965. He never knew that the German investigation would not begin until 2008 and would not produce a conviction. What he knew in September of 1944 was what was in the file on his desk. He read the intelligence annex. He read the account of the march. He knew the words. They swaggered. They flaunted their standards and flags. They even sang German marching songs as they went through the villages where only 1 week before they had murdered local people. He closed the file. He refused. And he moved to the next item on the agenda because there was still a war to fight, and a refusal when the file is on the desk and the room already understands it does not need to be explained at length. The Third Army records that contain the documentation of the Beaugency surrender, the report, the intelligence annex, and the documentation of Patton's response are in the National Archives in College Park, Maryland. The French investigation into the Maillé Massacre is in the French National Archives in Paris. The list of 124 names, with ages beside each one, is in it. René Auguste Moreau's name is in it, with his age, 11, and his father's testimony beside it. Auguste Moreau, the father who had left the village before dawn to work a field in the neighboring commune and came home in the afternoon to find what Maillé had become, submitted his testimony to the French Investigation Commission in 1946. At the end of it, he said he wanted his son's name in the official record. He said, he was 11 years old, and he deserves to have his name written down correctly by someone who knew him. That request is in the French National Archives. It has been there since 1946. The investigation record sits beside it. In the National Archives in College Park, the Third Army records sit in their boxes. The intelligence annex, the surrender report, the documented absence of a visit, a message, a ceremony, a handshake. 124 names. 48 of them children. 3 months old to 14 years old. That is what the handshake would have been extended across. Patton read the file. He understood what the bridge ceremony was and what it was not. And he kept his hand at his side. Subscribe and share this with someone who needs to know what was in that file. Hit like if you believe 124 names deserve to be in the room when the handshake was considered. The next story I'm going to tell you involves a document found in the personal effects of a senior Wehrmacht officer taken prisoner by Patton's forces in April of 1945, a letter he had written to his wife the night before his unit entered a French village, and what the letter said about what he knew was going to happen in the morning. There's one more thing the cameras did not show, and it matters. The newsreel cameras at the Bugency Bridge captured what every newsreel camera is designed to capture: the visible, the ceremonial, the transferable. They captured Elster in his Wehrmacht general's uniform, decorations intact, posture correct, extending his hand to Major General Robert C. Maillé. They captured the signing of the documents. They captured the column of 19,600 men beginning the process of laying down the arms they had been allowed to carry through 120 kilometers of French territory. It was, as the description in the record notes, one of the best covered surrenders of this or any war. The cameras did exactly what cameras do. They recorded the moment of transfer. They did not record what was on the other side of the transfer, what the Loire Valley villages looked like, what the French civilians who watched the column march through with its singing and its swagger felt when the singing had passed and the village was quiet again. Cameras record what is in front of them. Patton was not in front of the cameras at Bugency. He was at 3rd Army headquarters, reading the file. Major General Robert C. Maillé, 48 years old, from Macon, Georgia, a man whose hometown shared his surname, which was noted in every press account of the ceremony, because American journalists in 1944 understood the value of a good biographical coincidence, was the officer who extended his hand on the bridge. Maillé was the commanding general of the 83rd Infantry Division. He was operating under Patton's 3rd Army authority. He accepted the surrender because it was his operational responsibility to do so. The surrender was valid. The processing of 19,600 prisoners was a significant logistical undertaking that Maillé's division handled correctly. None of that is in dispute. Maillé did what the situation required him to do, and he did it correctly. The cameras recorded it. The newsreels were distributed. The number 19,600 was celebrated as the largest single surrender on the Western Front. And in the 3rd Army headquarters records, Patton's response to the question of whether he would extend any personal military courtesy to Elster is documented without ambiguity. He would not. The distinction matters, because what Patton was refusing was not the validity of the surrender. He was not questioning the legality of what Maillé had done on the bridge. He was not contesting the prisoner of war status that Elster and his men were entitled to receive. What he was refusing was the layer of personal military honor that sits above the legal framework, the acknowledgement that goes beyond processing prisoners correctly, beyond following the Geneva Convention, beyond doing what the laws of war require. The layer that says, you did something that I, as a soldier, recognize and respect. The handshake on the bridge, the visit to the ceremony, the personal acknowledgement, these are the things that communicate that layer. Patton withheld them. He withheld them because of what was in the file, because of the annex, because of the singing. See, the question the file forced was a specific one, not whether Elster had done something militarily correct at the end. He had, not whether the surrender had saved lives. It had American lives and German lives both. The question the file forced was whether the correct thing at the end could be separated from everything that preceded it. Whether 19,600 on a bridge in September could be weighed independently of the singing in August. Whether the ceremony could be honored without honoring the march that led to it. Patton's answer, documented in the absence of a visit and in the records of what he said when the question was raised, was no. The march was not separable from the bridge. The singing was not separable from the surrender. Elster commanded the column. The column sang. The villages the column sang through had buried their dead 3 weeks earlier. These facts did not cancel each other. They existed together in the file on the desk, in the room that went quiet when Patton stated his position. There is one more element of the Bugency surrender that the newsreel cameras missed entirely. There is one more element of the Bugency surrender that the newsreel cameras did not capture and that the American military press coverage of 1944 substantially minimized. The French resistance had been doing the work that made Elster's surrender possible for weeks before any negotiation began. It was the resistance that had been ambushing the column, cutting off its escape routes, making the operational mathematics of fighting north to Germany impossible. The OSS officer, Samuel McGill, the American who established direct contact with Elster, had done so through resistance intermediaries, through the Maquis fighters who had been in those Loire Valley villages and those forests for months and years, who had organized, who had survived the occupation, who had watched their neighbors killed in reprisal actions, and continued fighting. When the surrender was announced, and when the American military and the American press framed it as a triumph of American air power, the U.S. Army Air Force specifically claimed that Elster's surrender represented the first time air power alone had forced a large enemy formation to capitulate. The French resistance responded with fury. They had not done what they had done for as long as they had done it, to have the credit assigned to American aircraft. Members of the French resistance formally protested the framing. Their protest is in the historical record. It was noted at the time and largely ignored by the American military press, which had a war to cover and a number, 19,600, that made a better headline than a debate about credit assignment. The resistance fighters who had escorted Elster's column north to Beaugency, who had lined the roads and watched the column march through with its swagger and its flags and its marching songs, watched the bridge ceremony from the riverbank. They had done the work. They had bled for it. Some of them had lost people in the reprisal actions that Elster's column had triggered on its passage through their territory. And they watched the cameras roll on the bridge, and they watched the handshakes, and they understood that the story being told was not entirely the story that had happened. Patton did not cross the Loire to shake Elster's hand. He did not attend the ceremony. He did not send a message of congratulation. In the Third Army records, his position on the Loire Valley surrender is documented in the words of the officers who were present when he stated it. The file was on the desk. The room was quiet. He moved to the next item. The resistance fighters who had watched from the riverbank did not know, in September of 1944, what Patton had decided in his headquarters. They only knew what they had seen: the column, the singing, the bridge, the cameras, the handshakes. They had their own understanding of what the handshake meant and what it did not. Patton's understanding, documented in the Third Army records, arrived at the same place from a different direction.